Look, is the president right? I want to go back to what we just played. He said they want us to keep bombing even if it jeopardizes because their life is in much greater danger. Is that true?
Tim, Carroll, it's great to be back with you. Look, I think there's an element of truth in that. I think that has been true from the beginning. But I would say that feeling was much more intense 5 weeks ago when this war began, where a lot of Iranians, a clear majority of Iranians, probably had this hope. And it was just a hope because they weren't sure exactly how it's going to play out. But the hope was the United States, this mighty superpower, is going to intervene and the Islamic Republic will be poof, gone. And we can go back to our lives just like things were before 1979. But as this war has sort of dragged on and more civilian infrastructure have been hit and more Iranian civilians have died, I'm not sure if what the president said is as black and white today was 5 weeks ago. For sure, a lot of Iranians are still hoping at the end of this war, the Islamic Republic will be gone. The big question they have is, will there be much of an Iran, the country, left by the time this war is over?
Yeah, that is actually, I mean, that speaks to then further military action to wipe everything out. And do you think at this point that that's the goal of the United States and Israel, for that matter, after we just have spent the last couple of years watching what has happened to the Gaza Strip and Palestinians between the war between Israel and Gaza?
Yeah, so Carol, I mean, that's exactly how people in the region look at it. Look, I need to make a big distinction. Israel and the United States are two different countries, two different approaches to the region. Obviously, you know, they're also sit in different parts of the world. Israel is in the region, the United States is across the world. So that's why also they look at things differently. The Israelis have had and continue to have, you know, a position where, you know, they rather have weak states nearby. Or they don't care what nature politics you have, as long as you're weak and you don't pose a threat. United States, not so. United States, I think, fundamentally would like to see Iran, a country of 93 million people, huge market, huge hungry market that's been, you know, ostracized because of its own policies for almost a half a century, that could come back, where this market could open up opportunities for plenty of businesses in all sorts of sectors, from aviation, oil, gas, tourism, you name it. So the idea of Iran collapsing is not in the interest of the United States. But the problem you have right now is how much and whether at all the United States can actually kind of bring this regime either down or change its ways so you don't end up collapsing the country, if you will. That's where the president is at right now.
Is the threat to take out civilian infrastructure a real threat? And the reason I ask is because there was this great interview earlier on Bloomberg Surveillance, Gautam Mukunda of Yale. He's also a Bloomberg opinion columnist. And he made this great point. He said, you know, if you take out civilian infrastructure, then it just increases the desire to hold on to the Strait of Hormuz as a leverage point.
Yeah, if you can.
If you can.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, it doesn't take much to scare captains away. I mean, you don't have to hit every single tanker to put a big dent in the flow of traffic. Yeah, and these drones are not that expensive, and Iran have tens of thousands of them. And the country's pretty big. You can fly a drone up from a new point in Iran. And even if you occupy southern Iran, the Iranians can still fly off drones from northern Iran. And I'm not saying they're going to stop all traffic, but it can still pose a serious risk to it. But, you know, the Strait of Hormuz being a leverage point for the Iranians, absolutely that's true, and probably will be true until there's a political settlement. But the other thing that we have to keep in mind, and this is really important for us to keep in mind, I'm sure the president is very conscious of this, the Iranians will hit in kind. If you take out their power system, a power grid and so on, they are going to do the same thing to U.S. allies on the other side of the Persian Gulf, places like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. And even if the United States is not necessarily going to be directly impacted, it will have an impact on the United States. You know, there are so many American companies that operate in that part of the world. There are hundreds of billions of dollars in investment and so forth. So this idea that we can just hit them, but if the Iranians hit the Gulf Arab states, who cares? Well, I think the United States will feel the impact, and obviously the Gulf states, to the extent that they can, I'm sure, trying to be busy and shape Trump administration's next steps here, because they know they're going to be frontline states and the first targets.
Yeah, you do wonder about the threshold of pain among the Middle Eastern allies of the United States, if we're getting close to that as you continue to see destruction there. Having said that, I want to go back to how you kick things off, that Israel wants weaker states nearby, including Iran. U.S. would like to see maybe a new Iran. I mean, that's a big conflict between the two. Whose war is this?
Look, we all know the discussion here in the United States the last 5 weeks, how, the discussion about how the president was convinced to do this. But that's kind of late in the day now
But isn't that a problem then in terms of getting yourself out of it?
Look, if the Israelis insist on regime change, in the sense entirely new set of people that run the place, then I could see the United States president having a problem with that, because his goals potentially he's setting the bar far lower than that. I mean, he's essentially talking about potentially the Venezuela model, which is someone from within this existing regime who's willing to cut a deal that's good enough for the United States. I'm not sure if that's good enough for Israel, and that could become a point of contention. But Kara, end of the day, Israel cannot be in this war with Iran alone. Everyone knows that. The Israelis would admit to that publicly. They're only in this war because the United States is backing them up. And so it doesn't really matter what Israel feels like on that issue. If the United States feels for its interest it's time to get out and cut a deal, then Israel has no reason or no ability really in the longer term to stay in that war alone against the Iranians.
Alex, we've spoken to you quite a bit over the last 5 weeks about different elements of this conflict, including the government and what is left of the government, the IRGC. And I want to go back to the IRGC and sort of like what you've been able to gather based on public disclosures, just based on your own sources, about the strength of the IRGC right now. What would you say the status is?
Look, they're running the show today more so than they did before this war.
More so.
More so. But it's a mistake to assume that IRGC came from nowhere and suddenly is running the place. I would say IRGC has been sort of gradually becoming a bigger deep state actor in Iran for at least 20 years. But they just have that much more power after Khamenei was assassinated on 28th of February. But I also think it's a mistake to assume just because IRGC people are more in the driver's seat today than before, that means a hardening of their position. I have no reason to doubt that they are ideologically committed, but I would also say, and this is an important point in many ways, they're not suicidal in the sense that, they might be fanatics from our perspective, but they also want to live for another day. So the question then is, can there be a middle ground between the US position, the Iranian position, so these guys survive? And a lot of people obviously going to hate that, including the majority of Iranians who are hoping this regime will go as a result of this war. But I don't know if the United States is still ready for that regime change scenario. We heard some things being said by President Trump in his press conference, talking about, he was walking back some of his comments from last week. He upset a lot of Iranians talking about putting Iran back in the Stone Age. He was walking that back, but he still hasn't articulated a clear-cut, regime change policy going forward, because obviously that's a major undertaking.
So to that point, Alex, what happens if tomorrow night at 8 p.m. passes and there's no agreement from Iran? And the president doesn't follow through with bombing these civilian targets? What happens then?
Well, look, the president has already kind of hinted at this counter proposal that came from Iran, this 10 points that the Pakistanis brought back to the United States. He said it's not good enough, but it's significant. That could give him enough room here for him to say, well, for now, I'm holding back. He's done that repeatedly. So he could do that. But if, otherwise we're going to stay in this war of attrition for some time. Not necessarily sure if that's a good thing for the United States. The Iranians regime is better placed to engage in a war of attrition than the United States. So I hope if diplomacy is the way forward, that, there'll be a big push, a big jolt to this. So you get something going forward on the diplomatic track that's actually meaningful, will put an end to this global economy being taken hostage by this conflict.
Alex, though, what does this do for, I just think, the ability for a nation, an entity, a country, the U.S. or Israel for that matter, to wage war on another? Like, I just think whether or not, breaking of international law and so on, it's just, you think about the U.S., right? Typically we would need Congress, or it needs to be a threat, Iran. And we know that Iran and the U.S. have not been good for decades. But I'm just curious about what is going on and the actions taken by the U.S. specifically in Israel.
Kara, I think if this was any other political system of the Islamic Republic, it would have been much harder for the United States to get away with this. The fact that this is such a horrendous regime with so much blood on its hands, including killing tens of thousands of Iranians just recently in January, kind of gave the U.S. that kind of space where it could attack essentially, based on international law, and you don't have to take my word for it. That's what jurists out there around the world are saying, to attack another country without really an imminent threat being posed by Iran. Even though you don't like the regime going back to Khomeini in 79, there was no imminent threat. And I don't care what the president keeps saying about it, there was one. There is no evidence there was one. But the fact that he gets away with it and the rest of the world pretty much is accepting it is because of the nature of the Islamic Republic, because it's just such a horrendous system to its own people and has been such a bad actor for so long. But I can tell you, Carol, talking to folks in Europe, in the Middle East and elsewhere, there are question marks about, what does this mean for international law going forward?